let me bring in my guest. Joining me tonight in Akron, Ohio, radio news reporter who covered Dahmer's trial for the murder of Steve Hicks. This was the second trial, but actually an earlier victim. Joyce Johnson is with us. And retired TV reporter Don Olson is also with us. He was present for Dahmer's Ohio trial and was present for the dig on Dahmer's property. Joining us also in New York City, psychotherapist and host of Talking Live on Facebook Watch and the Bite Side podcast, Dr. Robi Ludwig is with us. Great to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
This is a topic not easy, but I think all of you have a perspective that's important tonight. Dr. Robi Ludwig, I just want to start with you and your reaction to what we just heard from Dahmer at his sentencing all these years later. What struck you about what he said in that moment?
Well, as you could see, there was a composure there, and he seemed to be extremely aware of what he had done and that he was wrong and that he would not be forgiven for the extremity of his crimes and how unusual they were. So it was interesting to see that. And yet we know from some of the psychiatrists who had evaluated him that he appeared to be psychotic at times and paranoid and had a whole list of character disorders that contributed to some of his behaviors. But I think the most striking is that there was a timidity there and an understanding of the evilness of his actions.
Joyce, let me start with you. Take us there now. The trial you're at is for his first victim in Ohio, right? That's
correct.
But he's already been convicted, and everyone knew about the atrocities and what he had done. Take us to that courtroom. What was it like? When you think back, what kind of sticks in your mind about that point in time?
Amazingly, it was how brief it actually went. Dahmer had already been sentenced to 15 life terms when he was in Wisconsin, and he pleaded guilty to a charge of aggravated murder in the death of Stephen Hicks, who was his first victim. He was known as the hitchhiker. Now, Hicks was on his way to a concert, was offered beer, was offered a little party, and then Dahmer had promised he would take him to the concert. Of course, that did not happen. And Summit County Common Pleas Judge James R. Williams sentenced Dahmer to another life sentence after hearing the statements from the family members. And the sentence was to run consecutively with the time that Dahmer served in Wisconsin. He was asked his plea to the first count, and Dahmer just simply said, "Guilty as charged, Your Honor." He did not make a statement. And his attorney, he had several attorneys, but one of his attorneys said that he was indeed remorseful, especially in this particular case because it was his first victim, and even said that he was very nervous about coming back to Ohio because of how he felt about this case. His attorney said that, he felt he didn't make a statement because he had said everything he wanted to say while he was in court in Milwaukee. So the actual courtroom version was extremely short, and we were kept in a side room where we were viewing it. He was let in, and he was actually in Ohio a very short amount of time. He was processed into the state's prison system at Lorraine Correctional Institution in Grafton later that day, and after the processing, he was returned to Wisconsin.
Don, how about this dig site? Describe for us what was going on there, who showed up, and what it was like, what that atmosphere was like.
Well, Dahmer was from Bath Township, which is a rural, upscale suburb of Akron. And the first thing that comes to my mind is the media circus that was there that week. I think the dig, the excavation of his yard took about 4 days, and there were live trucks, satellite trucks back then, all the way down the road, I'd say about a quarter of a mile down the road and around the corner. There was media there from Pittsburgh to Chicago to all of the cable networks, the broadcast networks. And as the week went on, it just, I don't know, it became worse. And there was even a lemonade stand that was set up by some of the kids in the neighborhood. So you can imagine how the Hicks family felt about watching this day in and day out, and then seeing this media circus all around the tragic death of their son.
Joyce Johnson, Don Olson staying with us. Dr. Robi Ludwig staying with us as well. When we come back, more involving Jeffrey Dahmer. We're taking, in all my years of covering murder trials, I've covered so many of them. That's Rita Isabel, and she brought out the real impact. We hear about victim impact statements all the time, but I mean, anytime I've seen that, listened to it, and just watching it again, it demonstrates, I believe, the real impact that these cases, these crimes, these awful, awful people have on the lives of so many. Let me bring back in my guests. Joyce Johnson, Don Olson are with us. They covered one of Jeffrey Dahmer's trials. Dr. Robi Ludwig with us. Dr. Robi, it's difficult to watch that. I do, though, watch it every once in a while to remind myself, don't get lost in the evidence, the this, the that. Like, all these cases, all these murders are about real people, real impact. And I think what Rita expressed there, I think is part of what every victim feels in some respect.
No, it was very powerful to see that kind of reaction. And I think it's very painful for outsiders or people to think about the victims, because it's so painful, and it leaves us all feeling vulnerable, because we know that this can happen to anyone at any time, and nobody wants to feel that vulnerable to criminals, especially very disturbed ones. And this is being revisited with the new series that's out that also makes Jeffrey Dahmer look a little bit more sympathetic. So you can imagine that adds insult to injury, presenting this man who was clearly very troubled and dangerous in this way that's a little sympathetic. But I think it's a good reminder that the families never forget what happens and will live with this every day of their lives.
And Joyce, at that second trial for the family of Steve Hicks, what was that experience like for them? And did they have that same sort of opportunity to directly address Jeffrey Dahmer, or did they have to speak to, sometimes you have to speak to the judge? In this case, there was an opportunity to speak directly to Dahmer.
Well, they had the opportunity, and it's interesting because one of the things, and many of us ask, why bring him here again? He's already been sentenced to 15 life terms in Wisconsin. But then we realized it's going to give the relatives a chance to express their feelings. That was one of the reasons that he was brought back to Ohio, according to Summit County Prosecutor Lynn Slaby at the time. And his mother, Martha Hicks, was very vehemently wanting him to go to the electric chair. She said she wants him to die. He was an animal. She wanted him to serve 800 years, whatever it took. But Ohio, although they have a death penalty now, the statute was not in effect at the time of Hicks' death. But she was able to describe her son, which she did very tenderly. His smile, she would say, would keep him out of trouble. And of course, never imagining that he would meet someone, and she described Dahmer as an absolute monster. But it gave the family the chance that they didn't have before.
So the family of another... Go ahead, Don.
I'm sorry, Vinny. At that statement that Martha Hicks gave at the sentencing, she said that she considered herself a religious person, but she did believe in the death penalty. And as Joyce just said, we did not have a death penalty in 1978 when Stephen Hicks was killed. But she said if we did, that she would have liked to have flipped the switch herself.
Well, he did get sort of a death penalty. He was not incarcerated that long.
Yes, he did.
1994, right. He was killed. Konarak Synthasmophone, difficult last name to pronounce, one of his other victims. His family, he was only 14 years old when he was killed, just 14 years old. His family brought a civil suit against police based upon what happened. He had actually escaped partially, but then Dahmer was able to talk police out of doing anything and brought him back and then murdered him. But in that case, Jeffrey Dahmer had to testify for a civil deposition. Let's take a listen to some of that.
Well, what you told the police and what you told the psychiatrists in rather lurid detail is that your objective was to gain control of these people. Is that true?
That was part of it.
Was there anything else involved other than your asserting control over the victim?
There may have been, but I can't remember it right now.
Now, you did some very specific and rather unusual things to gain and exert that control, such as the use of sleeping medication and also the use of a drilling technique to put them in a zombie type of state.
Yes.
And both of those things were involved in your encounter with Konarak.
Right.
All right, let me talk about those for just a minute. You have a practice of mixing coffee with rum and then adding a sleeping medication by the name of Halican. Was that your practice?
Right.
And you did that with Konarak.
Yes.
Now, what dosage of Halican did you administer to Konarak?
I don't remember. More than one pill.
Much different look at Dahmer there than we saw with the little apology in the criminal case in that civil deposition. We're out of time for this segment. Big thank you to Joyce Johnson and Don Olson. Appreciate you on tonight. Dr. Robi Ludwig, always great to have you on as well. Thank you.